For more than a decade, investors celebrated Elizabeth Holmes as the future of medicine. Patients trusted her technology with their health. Politicians praised her vision. Few realized that the company at the center of all that optimism was already beginning to unravel. January 3rd, 2022, San Jose, California. Inside a federal courthouse, a jury foreperson rises. 22 hours of deliberation come down to this moment. Elizabeth Holmes stands. Once the youngest self-made female billionaire on the planet. Once worth $9 billion on paper. She is found guilty. 4 felony counts of fraud and conspiracy. Reporters sprint from the courtroom. Cameras flash outside on the courthouse steps. But the verdict answered only one question. The bigger mystery had haunted Silicon Valley for years. How had a 19-year-old college dropout convinced investors, former U.S. cabinet members, military generals, and one of America's biggest pharmacy chains to trust a machine that, according to prosecutors, could never do what it promised? The answer wasn't just about one company. It was about a system that rewarded bold promises long before demanding proof. It revealed how ambition, reputation, and billions of dollars combined to sustain one of the biggest corporate deceptions in modern history. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to 2003. Elizabeth Holmes wasn't the typical Silicon Valley founder. According to reporting by journalist John Carreyrou, colleagues remembered her as intensely driven and unusually self-assured for someone still in her teens. At Stanford University, she studied chemical engineering and became fascinated with the idea of transforming healthcare through technology. She dropped out that year and used her tuition money to start a company. She founded it under the name Real-Time Cures, later renamed Theranos, a fusion of the words therapy and diagnosis. Her pitch was simple, and it was seductive. A single drop of blood, pricked from a fingertip, could run hundreds of laboratory tests. No needles, no hospital labs, no waiting days for results. By 2004, she had raised her first $6 million from investors captivated by her vision and her voice, a deep baritone that colleagues later said she deliberately cultivated. By 2009, financial pressure was mounting, and she brought in Ramesh Balwani, known as Sunny, a software executive nearly 20 years her senior, who became both her company's chief operating officer and her secret romantic partner. He would later become her co-defendant and one of the central figures in the fraud. This mattered beyond Silicon Valley. The scandal made headlines from the BBC to the Financial Times and went on to become a best-selling book and 2 separate screen adaptations because the promise Theranos sold wasn't a purely American one. Cheaper, faster blood testing is something every healthcare system, from the NHS to the U.S. insurance market, has genuine reason to want. Now came the power move. By 2013, Theranos had signed a national retail partnership with Walgreens. Blood testing wellness centers opened inside Walgreens stores across Arizona and California, promising customers lab results within hours. By 2014, Theranos was valued at $9 billion. Holmes owned roughly half the company on paper, making her worth over $4 billion. Forbes named her the youngest self-made female billionaire in America. She appeared on the cover of magazines wearing black turtlenecks, styled in the image of Steve Jobs, whom she openly admired. Her board of directors was not full of scientists. It was stacked with 2 former U.S. Secretaries of State, Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, along with retired General James Mattis and former Senators Sam Nunn and Bill Frist. This was not an accident. To the outside world, Theranos looked unstoppable. Every magazine cover made Holmes look more visionary. Every new high-profile board member made the company appear more legitimate. With every funding round, the illusion became harder to question. But what the board didn't know, or didn't want to know, was that the company's own engineers were quietly panicking. Inside Theranos headquarters, engineers were confronting a very different reality. Behind closed doors, the company's flagship device, called the Edison, was failing the vast majority of the tests it claimed to run. Theranos claimed the Edison could perform hundreds of laboratory tests using just a few drops of blood from a finger prick. Traditional laboratories usually require larger blood samples collected from a vein because different tests need different amounts of blood and different processing methods. Engineers inside Theranos later testified that the company's device simply couldn't deliver that level of accuracy across the hundreds of tests it advertised. Internal engineers knew the finger prick technology could not reliably perform more than a small fraction of the tests being marketed. So, according to court testimony, Theranos secretly diluted blood samples and ran them on modified commercial machines built by Siemens, while telling investors, regulators, and patients that its own proprietary technology was doing the work. In other words, the breakthrough technology investors believed they were funding often wasn't performing the tests at all. Theranos was frequently relying on commercially available laboratory machines while presenting the results as evidence that its own revolutionary device actually worked. Every deception reaches a point where keeping the secret becomes harder than telling the truth. But what Theranos didn't know was that one of its own insiders was about to prove it. For Theranos, that moment arrived in the autumn of 2015. The timing was not a coincidence. Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou published an investigation based on interviews with former employees who had witnessed serious problems inside Theranos. Among those sources was Tyler Schultz, the grandson of board member George Schultz. After witnessing what he believed were serious problems with the company's testing, Tyler chose to speak out despite knowing the personal cost. According to reports, Theranos responded with aggressive lawyers, surveillance, and legal threats, leaving him caught between protecting patients and preserving his relationship with his own family. Carreyrou's reporting did more than expose Theranos. It forced regulators to take a closer look. Within months, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services inspected Theranos' laboratory in Newark, California, and found deficiencies serious enough to pose immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. In 2016, regulators banned Holmes from owning or operating a blood testing laboratory for 2 years. Walgreens ended its partnership and later sued the company. Investors who had poured hundreds of millions of dollars into Theranos began to realize their stakes were rapidly becoming worthless. The collapse of Theranos wasn't just another Silicon Valley failure. Here's what made it fundamentally different. When a social media company fails, people lose time. When an online retailer fails, investors lose money. But when a medical technology company fails, patients can lose trust in information guiding life-changing healthcare decisions. That was the real danger behind Theranos. But the story wasn't just about Elizabeth Holmes. It was also about a venture capital ecosystem that prized visionary storytelling over independent verification, and a board of powerful, aging statesmen who had little expertise in laboratory science but enormous ability to open doors in Washington and on Wall Street. Theranos raised over $700 million in total funding, without ever submitting its core blood testing technology for the kind of peer-reviewed scientific publication that medical devices normally require before reaching patients. This is why the case still matters far beyond Silicon Valley. It became the reference point regulators in Washington and London cite when discussing oversight of health technology startups, precisely because the failure was not detected by financial regulators first. It was detected by working scientists and lab technicians, several still in their 20s, who noticed the numbers simply did not add up, long before any government agency intervened. In June 2018, federal prosecutors indicted Holmes and Balwani on charges of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. This was not an accident of timing. That same year, the Securities and Exchange Commission separately charged Holmes with what it called an elaborate, years-long fraud, and she settled by paying a $500,000 penalty and surrendering voting control of the company, without admitting or denying the findings. A coordinated 1-2 punch between criminal and civil regulators. Both Holmes and Balwani pleaded not guilty to the criminal charges. Theranos dissolved completely in September 2018. Holmes's criminal trial began in August 2021, delayed in part by the birth of her first child that July. Over 3 months, jurors heard from Theranos scientists, patients who received false results, and investors, including members of the Walton and DeVos families. Holmes testified in her own defense for 7 days, alleging that Balwani had been emotionally and sexually abusive during their relationship, an allegation he has denied through his attorneys. On January 3, 2022, she was convicted on 4 of 11 counts, 3 counts of wire fraud against investors and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. She was acquitted on charges relating to defrauding patients directly. Balwani was tried separately later that year, without the jury hearing the abuse allegations, and was convicted on all 12 counts against him. So what happens now, and what does history tell us about cases like this one? In November 2022, Judge Edward Davila of the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California sentenced Holmes to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. Balwani received nearly 13 years, a longer sentence, reflecting his role as chief operating officer with direct daily oversight of lab operations. Holmes surrendered to federal prison Camp Bryan in Texas on May 30, 2023, an all-female minimum security facility roughly 100 miles from Houston. Both are appealing their convictions. Both have since seen their sentences modestly reduced through standard federal good conduct credit, a routine administrative process available to nonviolent first-time offenders, not a sign of innocence or a reduced verdict. Legal experts point to Theranos as one of the clearest modern examples of Silicon Valley fraud prosecuted to a criminal conviction, standing alongside cases like Enron and Bernie Madoff as a benchmark for how juries weigh deliberate deception against reckless overconfidence. The core legal question, one that will echo through future startup fraud cases, was whether Holmes genuinely believed her own claims about the technology, or whether she knowingly deceived the people who trusted her with their money and their health. The jury's answer was measured, not absolute. Guilty of defrauding sophisticated investors who had the resources and the means to investigate her claims. Not guilty on charges tied to defrauding everyday patients, a split verdict that legal scholars still debate today. Prosecutors originally sought a sentence closer to 15 years. Holmes's legal team argued for no more than 18 months. The enormous gap reflected just how divided legal experts remained over the true harm caused by a fraud built largely on promises rather than stolen cash. Based on current federal sentence calculations, Holmes is expected to be released in 2032, although that date could change through future legal proceedings or standard sentence adjustments. So what does this story really mean for how we trust ambition? Theranos was never just about blood testing. It was about what happens when charisma becomes more convincing than evidence. Investors trusted famous names. Politicians trusted reputation. Patients trusted science. But science doesn't care about confidence. It demands proof. In the end, the people who changed history weren't billionaires or politicians. They were young scientists, lab workers, and one determined journalist who refused to ignore what the evidence showed. Every financial fraud begins with the same promise. Trust me. Theranos proved that trust without verification can become one of the most expensive mistakes in modern business history. What do you think? Was Elizabeth Holmes a visionary who genuinely believed the technology would eventually catch up with her promises? Or did she knowingly build a company on claims that could never be proven? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to subscribe for more stories behind history's biggest financial crimes. Thanks for watching.